evaluation. I believe this is very important, not only as a researcher, as an economist, but also as a citizen, as an Italian citizen, as a citizen of Europe. Policy evaluation should be integrated more, both in economics department, but also in the policy-making process. And the award is just an example of the initiatives that IRVAPP is putting in place. And I definitely think that all the other initiatives you're doing, from your own policy evaluations, so the fact of keeping hiring researchers working in this field, it's very important, and it's actually a unique example in Italy, from what I know. Having said so, if everybody's in at this point, maybe I can start the presentation. I don't know if everybody agrees. What do you think, Nicola? Okay, maybe we can start. Okay, so welcome everybody, also the ones who have been a bit late. To introduce myself again, I'm Francesco Filippucci. I have a PhD from the Paris School of Economics, where I also work at the Institut de Politique Publique, and I also work as a consultant to the OECD Economics Department. And today I will be presenting you what used to be my job market paper, titled "What Do NEETs Need? The Joint Effect of Active and Passive Labor Market Policies." And please feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have questions or you want to, express doubts, or even just make considerations of possible, extensions. This is, it's a presentation, but it's part of a school, so it's supposed to be as interactive as possible. Oh, pardon. So let's start from the motivation for this work. As the title suggests, it starts from a policy problem, the problem of youth not in employment, education, or training, so-called needs. And these needs have been a persisting problem, particularly in some European countries, including Italy. As you can see, here you can see need rates for youths aged 20 to 24 in a sample of developed economies. And you can see that in some countries, such as Italy and Spain, need rates exploded, literally, with more than 1/3 of the population of youth not in employment, education, or training after the financial crisis in the early 2010s, to then come back to slightly lower levels, which remain nonetheless structurally high, not only in Italy and Spain. Actually, Italy has a very sad primacy on this, but also, in countries such as France, which will be the object of our study. And this is relatively larger than other contexts, such as, for example, Germany. So what makes the problem worse, the problem of needs worse, at least from an equity standpoint, not only from an efficiency standpoint, is that it is poorly educated and less advantaged youths who are more likely to become needs. So it's not only, that you have a bunch of workers, potentially productive, potentially useful, completely out of the labor force and having potentially scarring effects, but also these workers are often disadvantaged minorities. So there is also an equity problem besides an efficiency problem. Having said so, governments have tried to enact policies to rescue needs. And these policies can be broadly categorized in two kinds of policies: passive labor market policies and active labor market policy, where for passive policies, we generally can include cash transfer, social or unemployment insurance, forms of minimum guaranteed income. So any situation in which the youth is simply given some resources to rescue him from poverty and from its own fragility. While for active labor market policies, we intend rather training, job search assistance, subsidized employment, sort of programs that are supposed to improve the employability of the youth itself by, making him do some activities. So passive policies are widespread, especially in Europe, but the problem, economists have long argued that they risk having the unintended consequence of reducing labor supply. So eventually, there has been studies showing that the effect on employment of purely passive labor market policies can be negative. For example, if there is some sort of welfare dependence, youth get used to these benefits and do not look for a job anymore because they have these benefits. They're fine with them. And there is some evidence in our context that this might be ongoing. Another problem is that oftentimes the benefits are reduced once you find a job, once you start earning, generating so-called implicit taxation. When I start earning from my job, then my benefits get reduced. So I have even less incentives to look for a job, and the effect of the passive policies on employment can be even more negative. This as opposed to active labor market policies, where also we know that there has been an increasing share of expenditures, especially in OECD economies, especially in the latest year after COVID. But the problem here is actually that oftentimes youth do not participate in these policies. There is very low take-up to these policies, or they exercise low effort once they are enrolled in these policies. And this is unfortunate because these policies potentially have an effect which is on average at least positive. There is a large variation between programs, but on average we expect a positive effect from active labor market policies. There has been wide work, even meta-analyzing several evaluations showing that on average these policies have a positive effect, especially after completion of the program. So taking a step back, these two programs do seem sort of complementary, sort of compensating for the weakness of the other. Perhaps passive policies can give an incentive to take up active labor market policies, and active labor market policies can, compensate for the potentially negative effects on employment of passive labor market policies. And so no wonder the international institutions and countries have often combined them in programs jointly offering active and passive labor market policies. However, the economic literature has so far only evaluated one of the two components conditional on the other. So the effect of either active policies, for example, given to youth who would have anyway received some sort of passive support, for example, registered unemployed, or vice versa. We have evaluations of what happens if you give a cash transfer to youth who have anyway undertaken a training or an activation measure. And this is unfortunate, as the same reason why you want to combine the two programs is that you hope that the one component complements the other component, so that there are these sort of complementarities making the joint effect of active plus passive labor market policies larger than the sum of the two conditional effects. And there is some theoretical reason to imagine that this could happen. So I fill this empirical gap in the literature by asking myself the question, what is the effect of combining active and passive labor market policies? And so I do so by evaluating a flagship French program for disadvantaged youth not in employment, education, or training, aged between 16 and 25 years old, called Garantie Jeune. Now, the name should not sound too confounding. It's similar to Youth Guarantee, Garanzia Giovani in Italy, but it's simply the financing that comes from the same source, actually only in part, from the European Union Youth Employment Initiative. But then countries have discretion of designing their own programs. And in particular, the French program is very different from the Italian program, for example. So how does the French program look like? Here you have an outline. It lasts 4 quarters, so 1 year. And in the first quarter, you undergo a period of soft skills training in which they are collectively taught about things such as how to look for a job, how to build a curriculum, but even, very, very soft skills such as how to manage your time, your wealth, and so on. And throughout the rest of the year, youth are followed by a personalized counselor who meets them at least once every 15 days. And what does the counselor do besides generally supporting youth job search? He's specifically supposed to propose to the youth some so-called job immersions, so short-term work experiences, in which the youth goes to some partner firms for a very short period of time, up to 15 days, and carries out some small tasks, networks around, and hopefully looks for a permanent position in that firm. And importantly, on top of this mix of activation measures, there is a generous cash transfers for the whole year in which the youth participates in the program. And this cash transfer is equivalent to the French minimum income. Now, keep in mind that the French minimum income is not available for youth below 25 years old in France. So the only way that they have to get the French minimum income for 1 year is to participate in this program. And this was actually the initial purpose of the policy was the socialist government wanted to extend some sort of social insurance to youth below 25 years old. And so they decided to not only extend 1 year of cash support, but to combine it with activation measures. And by the way, this was quite well known in the news, was very important policy from the socialist government at the time, and it got relatively well publicized. So how do I evaluate this program? The setting that I face is that Garantijon is administered by so-called youth employment centers, abbreviated YEC. What are youth employment centers? These are simple employment centers, but focusing exactly on youths between 16 and 25 years old. These existed well before Garantijon. They were there already before. They were simply acting as employment centers. And they were having actually quite a number of programs already going on before Garantijon. And then Garantijon comes and is staggeredly adopted over the French territory between 2013 and 2017. And what you can see is that the adoption is quite scattered around. And basically every quarter, you have some new youth employment centers with its relative catchment area adopting the program, starting offering the program. This is important, of course, for identification. So what I built to evaluate, to exploit this setting is a novel data set, which uses two different administrative sources. First is the administrative system of youth employment centers, which records, for example, how much youth have been in contact with them, when did they arrive, which kinds of activities they undertook there, what are their characteristics, and so on. Conversely, they don't follow the youth, of course, when the youth loses contact with youth employment centers. So to actually have a full picture of the employment path of the youth, I have to merge this administrative system of youth employment centers with social security data on contracts signed by the youth who register with youth employment centers in the period of staggered adoption, so 2013, 2016, extremes included. And I see their employment history up until 2017, so up to 5 years after their registration with youth employment centers. So I obtain a population of youth who arrive to youth employment centers, and then I follow them over their employment history. There is no formal deregistration from youth employment centers. So even if they lose contact, but they can still appear as registered in the youth employment centers data. And it's a relatively large sample. So there is actually 2 million individuals in our data set, and there is actually 1/3 of probability of entering a youth employment center if you are a youth between 16 and 25 years old. This corresponds to, the bottom third of the French income distribution for youth age 16-25. So it's a relative disadvantaged population that tends to have low resources, low education, tends to be relatively, to have experienced more activities that are typical of adult life, such as having worked, having a kid, living independently from your parents, and so on. As a third important point to keep in mind is that once the program arrives in my youth employment center, it's not guaranteed that all youth in that youth employment centers are able to enroll in the program. It's actually a very small minority of the youth registered with youth employment centers which will enroll in the program. There is actually an eligibility condition for which only disadvantaged youth are eligible for the program. Basically, they have to show that they have resources below the threshold of the minimum guaranteed income and receiving no or few support from parents. And this is roughly 1/3 of the youth at youth employment centers. And second, even within this eligible subsample of youth, there is a formal and informal selection process. The informal part being youth employment center officers simply proposing the program just to youth who they think are more likely to succeed, perhaps. And the formal process is actually a formal application in which the youth has to demonstrate to be motivated for the program. And this is assessed by an independent commission after, also some quite cumbersome bureaucratic procedure. So at the end of the day, it will be a very minority of the youths who enroll in the program. Will actually be half of 30%. These estimates are from the Ministry of Labor. I only observe the share of youths actually enrolled in the program. At the end, I don't observe the selection process. So turning to identification, which is, I guess, the part where you from this school will be more interested about, because I know you've done quite some work with in the previous sessions on this. Let me give you a simplified illustration of what my setting looks like. So now this is, of course, simplified with respect to my data. What I see in my data is I see that there is some youths who arrive at youth employment centers at the same point in time. So it's t = 0, and these 3 youths register to 3 different youth employment centers. And I call these youths cores 0, C equals 0. So these cores of youths register with youth employment centers at T equals 0. There will be some youths then that will arrive at T equal 1 in the same youth employment centers. This will be C equal 1 of youths registering to youth employment centers at T equal 1. And then I follow these youths over their employment history with youth employment centers, so on and so forth. Then the program is staggeredly adopted by youth employment centers. So here you can see this gray shaded area, which represents the program, which, it's adopted before by this youth employment center here belonging to the first wave of the program, and later by these later waves of adoption. So what does this create is a situation in which from the same cohort, some youths are exposed at some point to the program, while some will be exposed only very much later. In other situations, some youths are immediately exposed to the program, and then they can enroll at any point. And in other situations, also youths are actually exposed from the very beginning of their registration with youth employment centers. But notice that the time where they start being exposed does not coincide with the time when the program starts being available in the youth employment center, simply because these youths, they register later to the youth employment centers. And so even though red light, staggered adoption, we know that we cannot really go for a fixed effect regression and get the results. We need to apply some sort of heterogeneity robust estimators, which you studied probably in the last sessions. The direct applications of these estimators, I focus on the Chess-Martin-Detfeuille, 2020. It's not so easy in this cohort context. And for example, suppose you want to tell what is the average effect of youths at this point in time, maybe subtracting, the baseline here and comparing it with a control group from these youth employment centers. You will see that at this point in time, there is a weird mix of treated youths. There is some youth who waited for some time and then got exposed, some youths who got exposed immediately and are already at the second period since the first time they got exposed to the program, and some youths who are still at the very first period of exposure to the program. And so a simple diff in diff will tell you a weird mix of exposure of youths. And so my solution is not so profound, but it shows a way to rearrange the architecture of these estimators to get some sense of them in this cohort context, is focus at a particular point after registration with youth employment centers. So we will focus, for example, one period after the youth have registered with youth employment centers, H equal 1. And the diff in this case will be, for example, for youths of this cohort here in this youth employment center who have been exposed for one period to the program, the diff in diff will be their outcome here minus the outcome of the earliest cohort from the same youth employment center not yet exposed to the program after one period since registration, so this cohort here. And this will be the first difference of the difference in differences estimator. And the second difference will be the same outcome in the same cohorts, but from youth employment centers where both cohorts are not yet exposed to the program. So the difference in difference will be this minus an average of these two cohorts at this point in time. And so on and so forth. For H equal 2, in this case, we will have, these youths being exposed for 2 periods. So we'll tell you the effect of being exposed for 2 periods minus the earliest cohort not yet exposed to the program, which in this case is this other cohort here, minus the evolution of the outcome in youth employment centers where both cohorts are not yet exposed. And notice that we drop these youth employment centers here as the treated cohort, the cohort corresponding to the treated one, is already partially exposed to the program, so we drop this from the control group. And so on, rolling over H. So from 1, 2, then we go to 3, 4, 5, etc. Questions so far? Okay, if you got the intuition, then we go to the bad formula, which is not so bad in the end. It should be quite familiar to you. It's a simple difference in differences for this DID HWC, where instead of IT, I just, or JT, depending from the groups, I just substitute with wave W and cohort C. And then there is this apex age, which just simply signals the fact that this will be a difference in difference estimator very similar to the Duchesne-Martin that feuille one, which is very similar to this, just with JT instead of WC and without H. The H simply signals this fact that you will roll over different times since registration with youth employment centers, over different horizons. But we'll not go through the formula in detail. Just get in mind that we'll have a lot of DIDHWC corresponding to different levels of exposure. And we want to aggregate them in a meaningful estimator of what happens if you're exposed to the program for 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, and so on. So we define G as the number of quarters that youths in a particular cell have been exposed to treatment. And in the paper, I show that an unbiased estimator of the effect since exposure, so of being exposed for G quarters, it's simply a weighted average of the DIDHWC for which G is equal to the actual level of exposure we want. So for example, if we want, what is the effect of being exposed for 1 quarter to the program, we just aggregate all DIDHWC in which the youth is exposed for 1 period to the program. For example, this one will be part of the aggregation, and we weight this DIDHWC by, the relatively weight in terms of population. So how many individuals are in that cell compared to the individuals that are in all the cells that we are aggregating. So it's a simple weighted average, which we show it's an unbiased estimator of the effect since exposure. And standard errors are clustered and bootstrapped as in the Duchesne-Martin theory. So armed with this, we can turn to the main results. What happens when our program of interest, when youth start being exposed to our program of interest, to Garantigia? So here are the main results. What you can see is that here on the x-axis, you will have what I called G before. So how many quarters you have been exposed to the program, or how many quarters you are away from being exposed for the negative values. And in the upper left panel, the outcome is enrollment in Garantigia. So it's the so-called first stage. As I told you, being exposed to the program, so being in a youth employment center where the program is available, does not mean that I will be able to enroll in the program. There is this selection process that I described before. And what I can see here is that there is actually a minority of the youth that eventually enrolls in the program. After 8 quarters, it's only about 10% of the youth exposed who actually enroll in the program. So it's a very selective program. And this is the first message we get from the first stage. The second interesting message is that, it doesn't look like there is a massive number of youths that registers to the program as soon as they get exposed to it. Sorry, that enrolls in the program as soon as they get exposed to it. It's not like, I'm exposed in the first quarter and bam, 10% of the youths enroll and then nobody else. It looks like overexposure, there is more and more youths adding to the program, enrolling in the program. So there is some youths who actually wait for, 8 quarters to be enrolled in the program, being exposed to it, but not yet enrolled, and then they enroll at the 8th quarter after 2 years, so not few. Turning to our outcomes of interest, employment, hours worked, and earnings. The first thing we notice is that there is quite a long and clear and reassuring on our identification strategy parallel trend. So there is no clear difference, significant difference between youths who are to be exposed and youths who are farther from exposure. So there is no, before exposure, there is no significant difference between exposed and unexposed. What is perhaps surprising is that there is no difference also in the first year of exposure. There is no significant difference between those youths who are being exposed for 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters to the program and the rest of the youths. When does the difference arises? It's from the 5th quarter onward, you start seeing an increasingly significant difference between exposed youths and not exposed one from the 5th quarter of exposure. And why is this interesting? What does this second red line mean? The program lasted 1 year. So this second red line is exactly the time when youths who enter the program immediately in the 1st quarter of exposure, these youths here, it is the time when they start exiting, completing the program. And so what you can think about is that we see already here in the ITT that it is when you start completing the program that we start seeing a positive significant ITT effect in employment, hours worked, and earnings as well. Perhaps interestingly, I told you I designed this DID methodology concerned about potential weakness of the fixed effect approach, but the fixed effect approach delivers actually quite a similar result. It's sometimes even more powerful. Standard errors are smaller. But this is perhaps, as you already seen in the slides, it's not rare. It happens oftentimes, especially in cases where you have, many waves. Just in I showed you the map. There were, many waves of significant amounts of territories entering the program. It's not like I had a very small initial wave and then a very big final one. We have quite a uniform staggered adoption, so perhaps no wonder that either the weights are not so, different or potentially negative, or the weights eventually compensate with each other for simple, statistical reasons. But anyway, we could not know this in advance, so that's why we designed all this methodology to see it comes up pretty similar, perhaps also reassuringly so on the goodness of our procedure.
Francesco, can I ask a question on this?
Sure.
Is the fact that the fixed effect is very similar to your estimated robust dynamic effect, as you were saying, to the fact that treatment is staggered and at the same time the effects in the first years don't seem to be very large, but the dynamic effect sort of kicks in later on? And so is that why it doesn't really mess up the fixed effect estimation? Like, would you expect it to be more of a problem if there was a very sharp increase in employment immediately after exposure to the program, for example?
No, to my understanding, I would expect it to be less of a problem in that case.
Less of a problem, okay.
In the sense, I mean, to my understanding, the issue is like this. If you have very different or negative weights, then if the effect is dynamic, you mess it up. While if the effect is static, then at the end of the day, it's a mix of.
But here what I'm saying is that the effect is also delayed, right? It's not immediate.
Yeah, but I'm not sure.
At least that's how I read the graph.
This for sure, it's like this, but I'm not sure how this worsens the problem, in the sense that this, if the effects were uniform over time and over
yeah, sure. In that case,
groups,
yeah, you don't have a problem.
Yeah,
you
don't have a problem even if the weights are messed up.
Sure.
My idea is that in my case, I cannot say because I didn't find a procedure to calculate the weights in my cohort setting. But my idea is that just like in the normal staggered adoption setting, weights are not so much messed up that, pass me the word, if you have, and this is actually what they are starting to work on, actually no, they described it in the paper, if you have many waves and relatively, each wave is relatively populated, it's not like you have one very small initial wave and a very big final one. In my case, I have a relatively balanced wave. They are expanded quite uniformly across the French territory. And so the weights at the end either compensate or are not so heterogeneous.
Okay. No, because my intuition, but it's really irrelevant for
me as well. It's
for the paper is that, as we saw in the class yesterday with the participants of the school, like the problem usually is the comparison of the late treated with the early treated, right? So comparing those who are going to be treated with those who got treated before.
Yeah.
And I think in your setting, that's just my gut feeling looking at the presentation now. The fact that the effect seems to take some time to kick in.
Yeah.
The fact that you don't immediately get, a bump in earnings, employment, and hours worked is in part attenuating the problem of dynamic effects in the two-way fixed effect specification. I'm not talking about your. So I'm just wondering, it would be interesting to check whether the fact that you're kind of getting this delayed effect, it's also what's not making the fixed effect screw up so much. But I don't want to take too much.
I'll have to think about it. I'll have to think about it, but I'm not so sure. I think that I think that it's actually the case that, you know, if it's just a switch, so if it just bam, one effect and then stays still.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. If the effect is constant and it stays still, it's
Yeah.
fine. But here, for example, the fact that, you know, in the first period after exposures, you don't really get much. It also means that sort of your treatment group still stays a good control group, right?
I see your point. Yes.
That's
Point.
my but yeah, I think it's you cannot know this ex ante, of course. It's good that you did this in any case.
I'm not sure it's good, but anyway, I did it, so I show it. Anyway, thanks for the question. No, it's a good point. I didn't think about it. So basically, we end up not having such a difference because eventually we have pretty good control groups, even in the first year of treatment. Okay, yet we might not be satisfied with these ITT effects. These ITT effects, recall, it's the effect on all youth exposed to the program. And within these youth exposed to the program, there is a very small minority which actually participates in the program, recall the first stage. So what we want to get is what in jargon is called the local average treatment effect, LATE. And my methodology allows to relatively easily obtain two different kinds of local average treatment effects. The first one is a very classical one, is the late since exposure. So it's simply a rescaling of the ITT by the first stage. So it gives simply an average effect on all takers who are exposed for a given amount of time. So for example, so it's not surprising that here we find 0 effect for the first year of exposure and a positive significant effect in the second year of exposure. What it's interesting is that here we can appreciate the magnitude of the implied effect on takers of our ITT. It's a 18 percentage points increase in employment, which is more than 50% increase compared to control group mean. Here I report only compliers mean because that's the only one I observed, but you recover control by subtracting the treatment effect from it. For these 48 hours worked on a quarterly basis and 700 euros, still quite strong results. And the second kind of late since exposure makes things even more interesting. Not late since exposure, late since enrollment, the second kind of late I obtain. How is this defined? This is, instead of being the effect for a given level of exposure, is the effect for having actually been enrolled in the program for some time. So before, for example, here, you know, this positive effect in the second year of exposure, there could be some youths who entered later in the program, some youths who entered before. So it's again a mix of youths at different stages of the program. Here instead, late since enrollment, we actually disentangle what is the effect associated to youths at a specific stage of the program. And how we do so, we basically exploit the fact that I have a lot of DID-HWC, and I do sort of a third stage regression in which I regress this effect, our DID-HWC for each cell, on the share of youths at different stages of the program in each cell. And so eventually I show in the paper that I get coefficients which tell me how much of the effect is related to the share of youths at a specific point of the program in that cell. And these identified actually the average effect since enrollment in the program. And here are the results. Interestingly, they show that there is sort of a 0 effect, again, on all our variables of interest, except perhaps a mildly negative effect on employment at the beginning of the program, so in the first semester of enrollment. While the whole positive effect is actually, it confirms our feeling that it was actually driven by youth who have completed the program, and the magnitude becomes even larger. So it's a 21 percentage points increase in employment, which is more than almost 80% increase with respect to counterfactual mean. But to hedge a bit against this very large positive effect after completion of the program, let me say that the effects are completely driven by temporary contracts. So either agency or fixed term contracts. And the results are also surprisingly similar to pilot evidence, which was obtained with very different methodologies. So it looks like both my study and an older study conducted only on the pilot wave found these very strong results after completion, which is perhaps suggests that this program is quite effective and keeps being effective across different waves. So let me use the last, maybe I will be 5 minutes late. Last time I have to give you some insights about the mechanisms behind this effect. And to disentangle the mechanism, namely to disentangle what is the role of the cash transfer, passive policies, and what is the role of activation measures, active policies, I use 2 additional sources of identification. The first one is to see if active labor market policies potentially have sort of a lock-in effect in which youths are too busy in activation measures to look for a job. I exploit the fact that activation measures are mostly concentrated in the early part of the treatment. So in the early part of the treatment, the youths are both very busy in doing stuff and they acquire most of the skills that the program will give to them, both in the training part and in the job immersions part. The second source of identification I use is the fact that the cash transfer of guarantee jeune is not fully cumulative with job earnings. Actually, it's cumulative only up to 300 euros. Let me explain this a bit more. If I'm in guarantee jeune, I'm in the program, I'm receiving the benefit, and I find a job that gives me up to 300 euros per month, then I keep the full benefit. So my gross earnings in the red here will be my labor earnings plus the full benefit. What happens if I start earning more? For every additional euro I earn above 300 euros, the benefit gets reduced quite substantially. 55 cents less every additional euro I earn per month until it's 0, roughly at the minimum wage. And hence, there is quite a sharp implicit taxation on earnings between 300 and 1,100 euros, about 1,100 euros. And guess what? Youths react to these strong incentives. How do I show this? I replicate the local average treatment effect table that I just showed you before, this time using as outcome, not employment in general, but the probability of earning in a specific income bracket between 1 and 300 euros, between 300 and 1,100 euros, where there is this implicit taxation of 55%, and above the minimum wage. And what I find is that in the first semester of enrollment, when youth are potentially locked in activities, they are busy doing training and job immersions, we observe a mild and generalized decrease in part-time employment. So why I say part-time employment, this is the minimum wage. So the only way you have to earn less than the minimum wage is to work less than full-time. So it looks like youth reduce part-time employment when they are busy doing activities, while if they find a full-time employment at the minimum wage, which is actually what this kind of disadvantaged population looks for, aims at best, it's not like they say, no, we don't take it because we're too busy in guarantee jeune. They actually take it and they go for it. Or they keep targeting their search on these kind of jobs. Anyway, there is few effect on these kinds of jobs. More interestingly, what happens in the second semester of enrollment when youths are free from activities and are receiving the cash transfer yet, so they're free to look for a job, but they face implicit taxation. They do find a job below 300 euros or above the minimum wage, but they massively escape from the implicitly taxed income brackets, suggesting perhaps that youths have some sort of sensitivity to the cash transfer. They want, it's not like youths are completely reactive to the amount of the cash transfer. They want to keep it, and they try to avoid those income brackets where this would imply that they do not earn much more while having to work. And finally, after completion, when youths receive no cash, no activities anymore, this is not surprising, they simply improve employment in terms of quality and quantity. So I gave you this, discursive interpretation in which I said that it looks like, youths have some sort of a lock-in effect and youths react to cash transfers, so have some sort of a positive labor supply. But this interpretation is quite discursive. In the paper, I have a more formal interpretation, which is based anyway on a quite simple labor supply model, discrete choice labor supply model, in which I show that, there is actually a negative effect associated to implicit taxation, a negative effect associated to the cash transfer, and a positive effect associated to activation measures that compensates for lock-in implied by activation measures and the negative effect of the cash transfer during the program, which remains after completion and drives the positive effect of the program overall. So to conclude, I showed that using a difference in difference strategy, Guarantee Jeune, composed of both active labor market policies and passive labor market policies, is able to increase employability of young NEETs, but this happens only after completion, only after youth have finished the program. And the mechanism part showed us that there's some sort of opposite effect of cash transfers and the lock-in part of activation on the one hand, reducing labor supply, reducing job search, compensated by a positive effect of activation measures per se. And this is quite relevant for the literature, not only for the literature, but also for policy. As you know, there have been different estimations of how much youths react to this kind of incentives, to the phase out of cash transfers, to implicit taxation. And this is personal experience with policymakers. Policymakers don't believe that if you give strong incentives to youth not to work in those income brackets, they don't believe that youth will behave strategically. I literally have heard the policymakers saying, no, but we don't believe that youth will do this calculation. Well, youth are smarter than you expect, perhaps, and they do reduce cash transfers if you give, sorry, they do reduce labor supply if you give strong incentives to do so. So in terms of policy implication, it's part of a good news for the French government and for policies for NEETs in general. We should combine active and passive labor market policies. It looks like they have a strong joint effect after completion, and they compensate for each other during the program. So it's sort of a success case, but we should be careful in taking external validity for guaranteed. And why I say so, basically because when I evaluated this program, there were when it covered the whole France, there were roughly 100,000, a bit more than 100,000 youth enrolling every year. Nowadays, there are more than 300,000. Basically because the government scaled up the program by easing the selection process after COVID, and recently now after the elections, changing the name of the program from, now it's not called anymore Guarantee Jeune, it's called CEJ. That to say that, once you enroll more people, you don't select people up front for the program, is not guaranteed at all that the effect will be the same. And comes out that I just published a note for the Ministry of Labor exactly on the evaluation of Guarantee Jeune, and of course, the government has jumped on it by saying, look, this is a positive effect. We're going to have massively positive effects also with our new program. This is not guaranteed at all, and that's why we're trying to push them to design a new evaluation for the new program enlarged to a broader population. On a side note, one implication is that for cash transfers, we show that implicit taxation generates this strong reaction in youth. The youth tend to avoid implicitly taxed income brackets. And this has strong implications for a broader range of passive policies, including, for example, guaranteed minimum income. You don't want to take it away completely when you find a job, as it happens in many countries. And finally, I hope that methodological innovation is kind of useful for labor economists or for economists, applied economists in general, phasing a diff in diff in a cohort setting. This cohort setting is not so unique. In my case, it's youth entering youth employment centers, but in labor economics, you can think about many others. For example, students entering schools in cohorts and then being staggeredly exposed to a program because the schools staggeredly adopts programs of any kind, or workers entering firms in cohorts, or patients entering hospitals, and then, staggered adoption again. In all these cases, my methodological innovation can provide an example of how to deal with these settings. And that's pretty much it. Questions so far?
I have one.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Francesco, for your presentation. Mine is more of a curiosity. Did you have the chance to look at gender differences in the treatment effects?
I did. I don't find much.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. Women are less. The participating women are less, but don't find much different. Eventually, all comes from an ITT, which is relatively small. So it's very hard to find large difference as long as, women would have a very precise 0. I don't see this.
Okay, and do you know if more or less women, did you know the gender composition, if it was balanced in the enrollment process?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. It's not. It's
Right.
relatively more men. Yeah.
Okay.
So if there are no questions.
Sorry, Francesco.
Yes.
No, I had 2 very quick questions. The first one, why was it implemented in a staggered version to start
Very
with?
good question. Yes.
And so the second one, if I may, is about the outcome. You said only temporary contracts, however.
Yes.
And if you have any clue about the length of the temporary contracts, or?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, 2 good questions. Let me start from the second. For the temporary contracts, I do have information on how long these contracts lasted until they, as long as they last. I have the type of the contract, and I observed them until 2017. So if they ended up if they are a temporary contract which ends up after 2017, I observe it's temporary, but I don't know when it will end. So that's the kind of limitation to do regressions with the duration of the temporary contracts. On the other hand, yeah, for temporary contracts, I might try to do something like this. Maybe dealing with the truncation, it's possible somehow. Part of the effect is also from agency contracts, which are generally even shorter. So it's unlikely that these are per se contracts which will last. What it could happen is that they are stepping stones toward more permanent forms of employment. But this, with only 1 year of effect, it's hard perhaps to grasp. Why did they staggeredly implement the policy? Because academics pushed for it? No, not really. But because the French system of policy evaluation is surprisingly well developed, and so there is tight interaction between academia and government is interested in evaluating the programs. And particularly, Garantie Jeune had quite a long work of ex ante design by studying even experimental trials of the components of the program. There was, for example, an experiment of what happens if I give the cash transfer only, what happens if I give only apprenticeships, and so on. And then a committee of experts suggested this sort of program, and the government indeed was concerned about the effects of the program because it would have otherwise entailed quite a large expense. And they decided to start in a relatively small number of regions, and then to extend it progressively as they see that the program works both in practice and in econometric terms. And that's where the pilot study I was citing intervened. They basically worked only on the very first wave. They saw it was working, so the program started getting extended to the rest of the territory. So it's not an easy answer. The answer is French policymakers cared. They do not always care, but right now, for example, for this CEJ, the successor of Garantie Jeune, which covers it's basically generalized to any kind of NEET, not only on disadvantaged ones, they are keen in doing an evaluation. So they are proactively contacting researchers and asking, how can we evaluate this? Of course, now that the program is already in place, it's kind of hard to come up with a counterfactual evaluation to do so, and you have to explain them. But maybe next time they remember ex ante, and so I think it's not, there's not magic solution. So they had this magic idea for which they did the staggered adoption without costs. It's sort of an institutional setting where politicians and policymakers are attentive to the culture of evaluation and to academia in general, and vice versa, academia proactively it's available for doing this kind of things, for participating to tenders, interacting with policymakers, and so on.
Thank you very much for the clarification. And it would be nice to have politicians in Italy which are as interested.
I mean, then you can wonder why there are no politicians like this. You end up a bit discussing. You probably end up discussing. I don't know. Municipalities in the 1200s, self-organized municipalities in the 1200s, social capital and things like this. But anyway.
Okay, we have no time for other questions. And thank you very much for your presentation, Francesco. I don't know if you, Mirko, if you want to say something in conclusion.
No, as promised, it was a great paper and a great presentation. So again, congratulations for the award, very well deserved. And everybody is invited to submit for the second edition.
Good luck for the second edition.
Guys, see you on Monday for the last part of the school, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Francesco, puoi rimanere ancora qua un attimo?